furthering the process. Now, one thing that neither of these projects looked at, what are the cumulative projects, impacts of these projects? So here's Ivanpah, where its footprint is. Okay, across the street in Nevada, they started building what's called the Silver State Project. And this is today, what's being built is the State Line Solar Project. So where do you think they moved the tortoises when they had to move them? They moved them from here to here. Where do you think they're going now? They're getting moved again. I mean, there are only about half of them left. There's not as many, but they're moving them again to a different site. So there's a lack of coordination still within this. And again, all these projects were proposed before the Great Western Solar Plan was developed, so they didn't fall under that. The BLM had no discretion to reject projects outright, etc. But the cumulative impacts were not really looked at in the solar pies as much as they should. We have 2 test cases in the last year of the Great Western Solar Plan and whether it's worked. There are 2 initial projects proposed. One is called Silurian Valley. The Silurian Valley, here's the Mojave Preserve again. There's Death Valley National Park. So it's a landscape that's seen as important for interconnectivity between national parks in this area. As you can see, it's very empty. This is actually taken from Google Earth by an organization not based in Range Watch. I forget, the Mojave Desert Watch, I think it's called. So it's a very empty landscape. And this was actually a combined solar and wind facility that was being proposed. And the short story is that this project was rejected by BLM. So BLM said, we're not going to let you guys build in this particular project. It's a very empty landscape, and it's there's some kind of significant historical trails going through the area from Native Americans and from the early settlers. So they actually rejected that particular project. And this is what the BLM said. They determined that this solar project would not be in the public interest after undergoing rigorous review processing according to the BLM's Western Solar Plan. So again, fantastic landscape. Why would you build it? But, the second project, if you've ever been out in the Mojave Desert and passed the sign that said ZZX, ZZYZX, I think is the name of the town. It's actually a UC reserve there. So a CSU reserve. So it's a place that ecologists could go to stay overnight and do research in the Mojave Desert if they're interested in that kind of work. And this is called Soda Mountain. Okay, this is a point above Soda Mountain. Soda Mountain would be that solar project we put here. Again, another very empty landscape. Looks very similar to the Silurian Valley. It's not very far from it. And this is actually right along the highway corridor, and this is actually on the other side of the highway. So they had a couple of different parts for this is just a solar power project. A couple pictures. This is from a photographer named Michael Gordon, who took some panoramas. So again, a very beautiful landscape, in many ways very similar to what we saw in other places. So the project in Silurian Valley was proposed by kind of a no-name startup company with not very many powerful players and maybe not much kind of financial investment back behind them. This is a project that was being proposed by Bechtel. Not BrightSource, but literally by Bechtel. They were going to buy solar panels from China and then build this big photovoltaic array. And here you see bighorn sheep suddenly became the star of the show. So we're seeing all these different kind of examples of extraordinary nature being kind of shown out to get public interest in this. And actually last week, Thomas Lovejoy and E.O. Wilson, if you don't know who they are as environmental studies people, you should know who those people are, published an op-ed basically saying we're all for solar projects. And so Soda Mountain was approved by BLM. Sorry, I forgot to say that. So BLM gave them the thumbs up, and that electricity was going to be bought by the Los Angeles Power and DWP, exactly, Department of Water and Power. And they published this op-ed, and they were basically drawing on research that was showing the importance of genetic resilience and having gene flow between bighorn sheep communities and how these particular blockages might stop that particular flow. So after this op-ed, actually right before this op-ed, DWP withdrew from the project. So this company no longer had a customer. And again, it was partly because of the awareness that was being raised around here. Now, where should we put these things? Okay, so I've spent a lot of time out there, and I saw lots of signs of real estate signs that said solar ready. So there's certainly power project. There's certainly land. This is actually in Rabbit Springs. Have you ever been Lucerne Valley, near right over the hill from Los Angeles? That's old alfalfa land. I can almost guarantee you're not going to find a desert tortoise there, right? And especially if they ever bring it back. And they have their water rights capped, so they don't really grow alfalfa there anymore. But that's a project site you could put it in. This was an ARA-funded DOE project that replaced lettuce growing in the Sonoran Desert, which if your intuition is why are they growing lettuce in the desert, that's a good question. But in this case, they actually, you can imagine they save water because they're not, it's already a landscape that's been, you know, tilled every year for lettuce production. So in this case, again, another really good place you could put. So you can still have large-scale solar power plants, and you have some of the issues, right? The big and cheap aren't going to be able to get across that, but you minimize some of the other ones. And then, obviously, there are other sites closer into the areas that actually use the electricity. The EPA has identified, what's the number here? Almost 2 million acres worth of brownfields, landfills, that would be more than willing, as if a landscape would be willing, that would be more than appropriate to site solar power plants. So you have lots of opportunities there. And then, of course, I always like to end with saying, if we're concerned about our cities overheating and the impacts of overheating cities on the elderly population, let's get them some shade to park under, right? And then we can kind of minimize maybe the heat island effect and some other things as well. And then there are other projects as well. There's every one of the early projects pretty much had a form letter that said you should build this in the Westlands Water District. And Westlands Water District is a very complicated animal for water rights and stuff like that, but they also have a lot of land that's been contaminated from overwatering cotton over the years, and there's a lot of selenium in the soil, so it's no good for agriculture, but it's right underneath the backbone of the electricity grid in California, so you wouldn't have to bring that electricity from afar. So lots of opportunities. Now, what shapes this social gap? There's a lot of text up here, but I'm going to walk through it rather quickly. One is perhaps as the green movement has taken on what you might call a reductionist epistemology of carbon. Right? We think only in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and what that means is if we think about the climate, we forget about the land. Right? And maybe there's something to that, and maybe that's why we're not thinking about that. Green halos. Hey, it's a solar project. Right? It's a green saint. We don't have to worry about, they're really, really great. All solar is great. Well, hopefully I've showed you maybe not all solar is great. We need to think about projects a little bit more. Part of that might be thinking about extraordinary nature versus ordinary nature and thinking about ways to protect the ordinary natures of the desert systems, which in many cases we might think about as, well, culturally I think there's a lot of people who are predisposed to think about deserts as wastelands. Public lands might be an intractable problem, partly because we've been very good stewards of those public lands. So even the solar energy zones are going to have environmental impacts because we've taken care of those lands to some extent, but maybe not so much. Why are some companies getting the support for this project? And what I'm saying here is that we could see politically powerful, or as I said earlier, less risky companies, right? If you're a big company, you might be less risky, receiving favorable treatment from natural resource agencies. And I think we see that time and time again still. The bigger explanation, I think, here is the power asymmetries that we're seeing on this particular. So a lot of people see this as unfair, and they see the profits accruing to people in ways that they don't necessarily think is a favorable. So it's all driven by profit to benefit big companies. They're not seeing kind of the benefits trickle back down, although they all recognize the benefits of having renewable energy. And then the social gap, institutional in origin. Those three mechanizations that I was saying, the new markets, the socialization of risk, and the virtual privatization of lands, had some institutional inertia that locked particular projects onto the landscape. So that was part of the controversy as well. Now, what can we learn? Broaden the considerations of alternatives. Right? We're really focused on different configurations of a particular power plant, not other sites, or not other strategies for deployment. Site with no regrets. Actually, the scientific advisory panel to the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan said, site projects where you know you're not going to regret citing a project. I mean, as loose as that sounds, we can see lots of projects were probably cited in areas we might regret. Participatory and collaborative planning. I think we saw the effects of some of that in the development of solar energy zones in general, but we didn't see necessarily that happen on a project-by-project basis. So that might be the next step. And then better incentivize distributed generation. I think that kind of has to, it's the only energy source we could put on we could live under. Right? And if we're trying to minimize impacts to the planet, let's live under more solar panels. I think that's kind of something we can do. So thank you very much. I know I went over time. Mouthful.
I have to ask this. Why doesn't San Jose State this campus has solar panels.
Our electricity is too cheap.
Well, but this
because we're tied in at a higher
level.
level.
What is the number one way to change it? Because I don't see any of the sites.
Students have to tax their energy. A carbon tax on their own energy.
Well, but how do you get there? I mean, that's what I think that we all need to be thinking about in active employees.
The folks in physical plant folks say that we pay like 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour, which is way too cheap. So that is never going to. And the CO says we can't pen it up. So we have to absorb the cost like they did when they built that new building, where there is some solar panels on the new student union, but that was not because it was penned out for the university. Yeah.
I just thought it was interesting when you're talking about the social gap, especially when we're talking about social gap in public opinion, especially through the 90s, up through the early 2000s, when you had certain protocols in place, whether you're talking about environmental impact statement versus environmental assessment, are two totally different things.
Right.
Because EISs, obviously, they have to be filed for public opinion.
Right.
EAs don't. They don't be filed at all. So nobody needs to know that doesn't to come into the public arena whatsoever. So, I mean, that's definitely a piece of strategy that a lot of big industries utilized. And Bechtel, they were in cahoots with the IMF and World Bank when they pushed over Agustín Tunari over in Bolivia. They were like sucking that water up like crazy. So they're a huge player in a lot of global industrial energy production and water harvesting.
Well, that's I think why they've received very favorable treatment, because they've got the social, they're built into the social networks, and that's the stuff that's very hard to document in this, obviously, because you don't have privy to private phone calls made between multinational corporations and regulators and stuff like that. So
it's crazy.
It's very you have to be speculative though. It's kind of a limitation of the work to some extent. I can't really say that is the case, but yes.
So 2 questions. So you said we should look into alternative sites, like mainly those dead agricultural zones. Would those sites mainly be photovoltaic, or would anything that would be solar thermal?
That's interesting. So when I started the work, about 80% of the proposals were solar thermal, and by about 2010, it had flipped. Many had converted away from solar thermal. A lot of them were parabolic troughs, not many were the power towers. I don't think you're ever going to see a power tower approved in California again. I think it's all going to be photovoltaics. And the truth is, the photovoltaics, the costs have come down so much that they're much cheaper to operate. They don't have moving parts. They don't have stuff that breaks down. And again, what they learned from Ivanpah is that this could be a serious ecological problem. So I don't think, and the photovoltaics have similar impacts. They don't have that heat flux. They have the lake effect. They're definitely, they find a lot of bird collisions with they give off polarized light cues, and the birds think it's water. So there are definitely some issues with it, but they're not as extensive, I would say.
So if we did utilize, say, all those zones to photovoltaic, do you think it could be on par with the energy capacity of that solar thermal plant for Ivanpah?
So you're asking basically the energy density of production.
Yeah.
How much can you get out of a particular parcel? The photovoltaics are already higher than solar thermal. So solar thermal is a bit of a dinosaur. In fact, people are very critical of this investment because the only advantage that solar thermal offers is the possibility of storage, of storing some of that heat for later to turn a turbine at night, which photovoltaics would have to be charged by batteries. So there is a value proposition for solar thermal, but it's not really being realized, and it's not during the middle of the day anymore. Only the photovoltaics are. Yes, Will?
I just think it's really interesting how these environmental debates, historical environmental debates, reemerge again and again. And since I have most of my 350 class in here, we're going to talk about this later, just think a little bit about conservation versus preservation and developing solar power on public lands.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank all of you for coming here today, and we'll see you around.
I do not see any way that the old field is defensible.
The what field?
The old field, the large scale solar. I mean, from a scientific perspective, from a biological perspective.